Perfect. So Joseph, I mean, we can start maybe if you want
Sure, absolutely. Well,
to,
welcome
to join us now.
Welcome everyone. Appreciate you attending this video webinar on data and blockchain and how it's important to the supply chain function. I'm here in Northern California. Stylianos is in London, and we have people from all over the world who are part of this call. What we'd like to do is maybe give you a little bit of an outline of where we'd like to start real quickly, because there's so much to cover in this topic. And we only have a little over an hour or so, and we'd like to cover as much as we can. It's a very, very exciting area because there's such a high demand for data, how we use data, etc. COVID has just amplified the need for data, especially focused in the supply chain, but data everywhere in our lives. So people are starting to use it in their personal lives, in their professional lives. And what we're finding, our studies that we've done 4 years in a row, we're doing a fifth one now, we'll be starting in a few weeks. And every other company, McKinsey, Accenture, whoever is out there does studies, we find that the need of knowledge exceeds the capacity of most organizations. The amount of data that comes into these organizations exceeds the capacity to interpret the data, to clean it, to organize it, and then glean some intelligence out of it. So what we thought we'd do today is when Stylianos and I talked about this idea, we said, maybe let's focus on maybe like 5 areas. One would be the importance in the current state of data credibility in most organizations when making decisions, because again, that's really what data is about. In most cases, it's either making a decision, or it's to reinforce learning, or to create new questions about learning when you think about how data is used. The second topic we thought we'd want to try to spend a little bit of time on is what's the maturity level of most organizations and how they can start to look at what their organizations are capable of doing as an enterprise, whether it be a profit or nonprofit organization or an educational institution. How do you use this data? How does blockchain work? Some basics. I'll turn that over to Stylianos when we get to that. Basically, how blockchain works. What is meant by the term a smart contract as we start to move into that direction. And by the way, we have a long ways to go in that area. And then will blockchain really advance the creation and utilization of smart contracts, primarily in the supply chain? But again, when we talk supply chain, the topics we're talking about are relevant to almost any function that exists in an organization. So when you look at, if I could go, and we also want to talk about our data audit guidelines that our association has created that's available online to help organizations figure out where they are. And it's a data audit, not an information technology audit, which probably many of you are familiar with. And that was needed. We created that. It's free. It's online at our website, at our association. So maybe my stating that I should give you our association, and then Stylianos can talk briefly about his organization in the UK, and then we'll get back to these subjects. So I founded an organization about 18 months ago called the International Association of Data Quality, Governance, and Analytics. Big, long name. The website is www.iadqga.com, and it's free. There's no cost. No cost to join the membership to anyone. What we're attempting to do is be a trusted source of information for those who want to learn more about how to use data, whether you're a student about ready to enter your job field, whether you're a working professional who now needs to use data more and more in his or her job, and they don't feel comfortable about it. And also the fourth group we're targeting is C-levels, who use a lot of the buzzwords around big data, really don't know what it means, have high expectations on their organizations. And in most cases, the data will show that these initiatives usually fail because of a lack of clearly defined objectives, a misunderstanding of what the capabilities of the organizations are, and a misunderstanding of the data they have access to. The tools work well. So it's not the tools, it's the data that goes into using the tools and the assumptions about the data that are the weak points. So yeah, I just want to just hand it over to you quickly so you can introduce yourself, and then we'll go into some of the content here.
Yeah, thank you, Joseph. So very happy to be here. Thanks everyone for joining. I understand people are coming from many different time zones. First of all, I think it would be good to share some links with so that anyone who's interested, they can learn more about our respective organizations. I'm a member of the International Association for Data Quality Governance Analytics, the organization that Joseph is heading. You can find, I'm sharing the link now in the chat. And there you're also going to find access to a document, which is the supply chain data audit guidelines, which we discussed today. Also, I'm the CEO of the Tesseract Academy, an organization whose mission is to educate decision makers and the public on topics such as data science, AI, and blockchain. We organize all kinds of events. Most of them are free on those topics. We have a few coming up this month, actually, and many more coming in autumn and winter. We're expecting a very busy winter. Nearly all of our events are online, so very easy to join them. And also, I've spent a good part of my career. I mean, I identify with the title of data scientist, but I've spent a good part of my career in what I call the soft part of data science. Things like data strategy, helping decision makers understand AI, etc. So if you want to learn more about my work personally, you can visit thedatascientist.com, which is my personal webpage. And you can also send me an email if you just want to get a copy of my book. And all that being said, I guess, Joseph, maybe a good place to start would be something I wanted to ask you, and I think that's a question that's relevant for all those people who are watching us now, is why did you feel the need to publish the supply chain data audit guidelines?
Yeah, well, you know, all of us probably on this call have been using data throughout our careers in various degrees. And what we found out was there really wasn't two things we started out with. Well, first off, with the assumptions of, do we even understand the terminology we use? So we actually created a data dictionary relative to the supply chain. We are not the author of it. We're the consolidator of it, if the best way to think about it. 8 or 10 other people have done work in this field and put out fragmented dictionaries. What we did is we consolidated all of their efforts, and the dictionary contains about 200 terms that are relative to supply chain. And we've published it. After we did that, we said, you know, okay, now that we have a set of glossary of terms that we can, when we start to talk about data, hopefully we can mean the same thing when we communicate. The next question was, do we have a way of assessing where we currently are? And what we found out was there really wasn't, which shocked us, at least that we could find a guideline on how you conduct a data audit. And it's important because you need to have trust and confidence in the data, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. That's one of the major weaknesses right now in most organizations, is the leadership of the organization in most cases has significant access to data. Sometimes that data isn't organized, it's not cleaned, etc., which creates problems. But even though they have access to the data, they're not confident in using it in decision making. And ultimately, organizations want to move to a data-driven decision-making process as opposed to being very subjective, which most of us operate in today. So we decided to create the data audit guidelines. It became a rather large document, so we decided to cut it back so it could be more practical and used by people and not intimidate people. So it's about a 28-page, 30-page document. It's online. I think the essence of it is in the middle of the document, there's about 58 questions. And it starts with a whole bunch of very basic questions. There's no right or wrong answers, but it makes you think. And so it's questions like, you know, do you have someone who's in charge of your data? I mean, that's an interesting question, right? We all use it, but is anybody even in charge of it? When I say is in charge, does that person validate the sources of the data? Does he or she determine where the data can be used? Does he or she validate that the data is complete, that it's accurate, that it's used in the proper way because it's used relevant to a certain topic and may not be used? So many of us, we all sit in meetings and we all look at data and we see something, and we don't know if it's a summary of something that was done 2 years ago for a different purpose, but yet we're trying to use that to make our decision. So that was the basic essence. I don't want to go into too much into the data audit, but it's there, it's available. I'd encourage you to use it. This is version 1. We'll probably have a version 2 as we go along and we get more constructive feedback by people who use the audit guidelines.
Great. And something else which I think you know, many people must be thinking about, I have my own opinion about this, is there something in supply chain which makes it different from other fields in terms of applying data science or blockchain, etc.?
Yeah. The supply chain functions, unfortunately, I think are way behind the curve of other functions and organizations. Most of the data was used and used rather efficiently in the marketing side of organizations. Supply chain is a long distance from the comfort factor of using data like marketing does. Most organizations have experience using the tools like artificial intelligence and machine learning, to some degree, not all, or even more advanced statistical analysis of the data than supply chain. So in the past, and I can speak of this because I had the benefit of being a chief procurement officer for large corporations in my career. We kind of use data as something that as typically data has been used, is looking in the rearview mirror. What happened in the past. We need to be better at predicting what might happen and work proactively as opposed to being reactionary. So the supply chain functions have a long ways to go. We're at a critical stage right now. When we see how the shortages of everything that we're seeing, and it was driven by COVID, of course, the shortage of almost all kinds of consumer products that we buy, or business to business. I mean, you look at the automotive industry, can't buy semiconductors, so therefore they can't buy cars or manufacture cars, excuse me, etc. You have simple things like packaging that isn't available, and people they can make the product, but they can't deliver it because they don't have the proper packaging to ship it. We see shortages of fuel. We see shortages of healthy drivers. I mean, the whole thing, the whole logistics aspect of it, the whole manufacturing and service industry too, of course, not just manufacturing. We're all being affected by it. So the supply chain function, and again, I'll be very critical of it because I was part of it. I think I can take that license to do that. We have an awful long ways to go to start to even get to neutral, in my opinion, and how we can use data.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. My opinion is that I think there is something about supply chain which seems to make it more attractive maybe for blockchain implementations, right? So I remember when blockchain first started out and there was this ICO boom and many scammers, and there were many people saying, oh, blockchain doesn't really have any real use cases. And supply chain, I think, was probably the first and real solid use case outside of the financial sector for blockchain. And I think there's something attractive about supply chain. Maybe it could be the fact that supply chains nowadays are super complex, since many of them operate on a global level. It could be the case that they're actually very important, like our quality of life to a large extent depends about supply chains, right? Imagine if one day you go to the supermarket and 50% of the supply chains had stopped working.
Yeah.
And all you can eat is, I don't know, porridge or something.
Yeah. Well, the supply chains obviously are extremely complex, and when everything works perfectly, you don't even see any impact on the supply chain. It's kind of invisible. What has happened is over the last 2 or 3 decades, most organizations have worked in trying to go as lean as possible. They have no inventory anywhere, and it's as long as everything's flowing at a consistent rate, it works well. When you look at supply chain, we use data all over the place, and this is going back to your comment about blockchain. We use data in defining our requirements. First of all, what do we need to buy, right, as an organization? Then we do it. We use data for supplier identification and selection. We have criteria, and we get data from the suppliers, and we use that data to say, okay, I'm going to go with this source versus that source. We use it in proposal, creation of proposals as buyers, business to business buyers. What do we need? A very interesting fact out of our 4th annual study last year, we started asking the question, do you include your data requirements when you issue a request for quote? And that's a document that a company would issue to another company saying, here's what I'd like to buy, products or services, and here's a definition of it. Very interesting. Less than 40% of the companies responded saying that they actually included their data requirements as part of their request for quote. And usually that discussion takes place after the due diligence and the signing of the contract. And that's not the place for that discussion, because if you need data to run your business and your supplier can't provide it to you, and the frequency or the level of detail or the format you need, how do you monitor that supply chain? So it's kind of interesting. It was always an after the fact discussion, and we want to move that discussion up front. We want to make sure that corporations start putting their data requirements in their RFQs. We use data in negotiations, right? We use data in contract administration. We'll talk about that a little bit later on with blockchain and smart contracts. We use all kinds of data in logistics, right? Trying to find out where the products are, when they're going to get there. In produce and things of that nature. I think you mentioned blockchain earlier. Some of the early successes were having traceability in produce, right? That needed to be maybe refrigerated or meats or other consumables. We use data in receiving. We use data in accounts payable. We use data all over the place in the supply chain. So it's absolutely critical to the functioning of the supply chain function that we have good, accurate, detailed data that's real time, as possible, that we feel comfortable with.
And I think in supply chain, I think there's an interesting synergy between IoT, AI, and blockchain. I know companies like IBM are investing heavily in this direction. I didn't have time to research this topic as much as I'd like to. I'm just wondering, I'm not sure if you have an opinion on that matter, or if anyone from our audience, they want to share their input, how robust this combination, right? Because in one way or another, supply chains, they're very complicated, and the longer the supply chain, the greater the chance that the part of it is going to seem opaque to some other part of it, right? Which means that there's also the possibility of human error. Yeah, so I think this was one of the main arguments against blockchain in the early days. That no matter what you do, if you require a human to input data, then there's always going to be a probability of error. So what's your opinion on that topic? Do you see like full-blown automation end-to-end taking place anytime soon? Because I know that's the vision, right?
Yeah, I think we have a very long ways to go. Even large corporations, what you see now is you see some very good, successful trials. You also see some trials that aren't as successful. We're learning, right? We're learning what do we do with this. Think of IoT, Internet of Things, where you have sensors all over the place, right? I mean, billions and billions of sensors worldwide, collecting all sorts of data. That data, the question is how much data do you want to capture? Because you can get inundated with it. And how much data really gives value to you. So we're building blocks when you think about this, because we started with this Internet of Things, right? These sensors all over, and then people realize they're sending it over these pipes to their like AWS or Google or wherever, they're massive databases, and they're finding out that they have, trillions of bits of data on something that the question is do they even need that data? Do they ever have the time to go in and look at it and analyze it and derive any benefit from it? So now you saw here in the last year or two, primarily, the evolution of computing on the edge. And so now what we have is we have all these sensors all over the place, whether it be in a factory or a car or a vehicle or an aircraft or whatever. And instead of sending massive amounts of data to some massive database for somebody hopefully to look at, we're using small, inexpensive computers at the edge. And what I mean by that is where these sensors are. And these sensors are now feeding that information to these computers, edge computing, these small devices, low cost. And those computers are making decisions whether they store the data or make a decision on it. So if you're looking at, let's say, I have a sensor that's monitoring the temperature of a machine, let's just say for simplicity. If the temperature is stable, I don't need to get 1 million bits of data on that machine being stable today. If it starts to vary beyond my accepted parameters, that's when I want to know that. So we've eliminated some of the network traffic and storage requirements of some of this data as we adopt things like IoT and computing on the edge. That said, now that data might be valuable to feed into blockchain. Blockchain, when we talk about it, I mean, it's great that the data, once it gets into the blockchain, you can't vary it. But if you're putting bad data into blockchain or more data than you need, you're not benefiting from the blockchain advantage. So a lot of good companies are out there trying these things. There are successes, all over the place, but it's nowhere near scale yet. And when we get there, I think it's going to be a while. As we know, introducing any new technology, change management, technology, infrastructure changes. The beauty of this is, though, it's changed from the last decade, let's say, where you had to have your big data warehouse and do the data. Now you can buy these services off of providers like Microsoft, Google, AWS, whoever you use, and it's low cost. So the ability to use data and the costs associated with it have improved dramatically. The question is as humans, how much data can we absorb to make decisions as real time as possible?
So I think you raised a few interesting things there. I love the fact that you mentioned edge, because I think computing at the edge is a really hot topic, whether we're talking about the possibilities that this opens up, or whether we're talking about technical issues and how to make algorithms run on the edge. That being said, I think there's also a question by Nirmal, who says, how will managing the supply data and blockchain have made supply chain crisis like today, since many industries are not able to meet basic material requirements? So I guess, maybe I can give my input, and then Joseph, you want to give your input. I guess the answer really depends, because if the material the lack of material is due to inefficiencies in the current the current supply chain, then this is where data science would actually help. I think blockchain itself, my opinion is that it is more helpful in things like auditing. So there's this very famous use case with how Walmart used blockchain for the provenance of food like salads,
Right.
to avoid health, to make sure that in terms of health and safety, everything improves, because they had some kind of contamination issue with, I don't remember what it was exactly, a few years back. Whereas I argue that the role of data science and AI is more like to increase efficiencies, whether this efficiency can mean lower costs, better times, or it might even mean creating marketplaces and then matching providers with each other, right? So any of those
Yeah. Well, I'd like to just comment on that. I agree with you 100%. It's not only efficiency, but it's also effectiveness. How well that data is being used in a way to move the organization forward. That is absolutely critical. I would encourage everyone, and I constantly say this, is not to chase the technology. Because most organizations, when you find out they're not capable of benefiting from the technology, and that's not to mean criticism, that's just where they are today. So I would encourage people not to chase the technology, but look at what you have today. Most companies have the basic tools to start to use data. And we go back to our study, and other studies continue to show that no matter what size the corporation is, Excel, believe it or not, is still the major tool in large corporations to do planning, data cleaning, and organizing, and maybe some visualization. So you have Google Sheets, you have Excel, most companies have access to these tools, and people feel comfortable with it. Those tools also have built-in, rather sophisticated statistical analysis capabilities. The question is do your people in the organization know what to do with the tool and how to interpret the output? Because the tools are there, they'll give you a number, you want to do a correlation coefficient against some independent variables on a decision. That's good, but if the tool gives you a value of 0.6 or something, whatever it is, what does that mean? People don't have clear understanding. So we have to go back to educating people on how to use data. And most times you'll see a 5-tier classification for data maturity. And the tiers, they kind of go from everything from the lowest level, which is descriptive analysis, which means what happened. That's what most of us are at. The way we use data is like, what happened? Okay. The next level is diagnostic analytics. It's kind of like, how did it happen? So can we get to that level of what caused that? The next level is predictive analysis, and we talked there about like what will happen with some degree of confidence. The fourth one is prescriptive analysis, like what should we do about it? And then the most highest level is, really cognitive self-learning analysis. And what don't I know? Most organizations, when they self-assess themselves, they fall 80 to 90% into that lowest category, that their ability to use data now is still looking in the rearview mirror or descriptive analysis as to what happened. Well, we all know in today's world, that might have sufficed, 5, 10 years ago, when things moved much quicker, or excuse me, much slower. In today's world, knowing what happened even yesterday may not even be relevant, because our markets, our demands change so dramatically. Just our need of information. You think about, and I kind of use this example always when talking to people about, let's not really chase the technology. Let's assess what we have today and feel comfortable and get the organization mature enough to use the data. Think about how we today, when we go into an organization, whatever it is, profit, nonprofit, educational, we have access to data. In most cases, that access to data is usually we have to go to someone to use SQL or some other software tool to extract data for us. Usually that could take hours, or some places even days or longer, to get some data out of your systems. We would not tolerate that in our personal lives. You think about what we do. We talk to our smartphone, we ask it a question verbally without any coding, and it comes back with an answer to us in nanoseconds, right? So the advancement of technology for our consumer world has far exceeded our ability to use technology in our organizational world. And that has to change. And until that does, until I can go to my company or my nonprofit or whatever and speak to, through some device, a source of data, and it gives me an answer back, we are way, way behind. So when you said earlier, we had this question like, where are we? We're still a long ways to go. That said, you don't need to be a big organization with deep pockets to take advantage of the technologies that are out there. We just need to understand what the technology does, get confidence in the data, and have an organization that knows what to do with that data to advance it.
And I think there's a very interesting question from Bernard, who has to go and after the recording. The recording will be uploaded hopefully tomorrow. I'll definitely be uploading it on the Tesla Academy blog. So make sure to register to get updates, and obviously on YouTube. The question is around how small businesses could benefit from this, especially like mom and pop shops. And that's interesting, because I think, in my opinion, many of them will not benefit in the sense that, I mean, they will benefit because this technology will be implemented at some other part of this, process, not because they themselves are going to do some kind of major implementation of AI in their own supply chain. What do you think, Joseph?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Small organizations don't have somebody who can work and create a vision or create an infrastructure. That said, they have plenty of access to information, or they can create the information easily. Let's say that most of their customers use credit cards. Well, you can download information from the credit card providers that'll tell you, time of day, what was bought, etc. They probably have some. It could be very basic, but they could have probably some sort of inventory management, whether it be something as simple as on a spreadsheet or something else, that they're capturing data and they can kind of see where the inventory gets relieved or new inventory comes in. They probably have some way, either whether it's simple through their checking system or other small organization financial systems that most of them use. I want to try to stay away from company names, but we all know that there's tools out there that small companies use, and they can see what they're buying and what they're paying for it. They can link it to publicly available data they can download. If they're selling ice cream, they can download data from NOAA for free and see what the weather temperature was for as many days as they want years back. And they say, okay, my sales are relevant to the temperature and the weather conditions. So maybe I can use that to be able to predict. I got a reasonable forecast for the next 5 days. It can help me figure out how many people I need to be on board to sell my ice cream, as an example, or how much ice cream I should buy and have on hand. I can see what flavors are. Again, I'm giving you very basic examples, but what flavors are selling more than others. These are all things that there's data there. They don't have to be a large organization to start thinking about using data and how they can use data to help them advance their organization's mission, whether it be profit or nonprofit.
No, this makes sense. I think I agree with most of those points. I don't know whether there are like any other questions from the audience. I mean, something I've been wondering. I was hoping we'd get a bit more interaction. I was wondering how many of the people in the audience are supply chain professionals. How many of them are just interested in data science, AI, and blockchain? Because it would be good to get all kinds of perspectives, right? Because usually the magic happens when you get professionals and expertise from all those different fields to meet in the middle, somewhere in the middle. This is at least my opinion. I don't know if you, Joseph, or someone else has anything to comment on that.
Yeah, well, I'd like to say again, I keep beating the horse here on the idea of education. Our studies have shown over year, and that's what's nice because we're about ready to go into our fifth year. So we're issuing our survey soon, and we'll have that data available in 60 or 90 days. But what we've seen over the last 4 years is we're targeting the supply chain on the studies. What we're seeing is a slow migration, nowhere near the speed necessary to advance the profession in using data. The good news is it's going in the right direction. The bad news is it's going at an unacceptable rate, in my opinion. One of the things we're seeing, which is kind of interesting, was one of the questions we ask in the study is, how much do you spend to educate, again, this maturity level of your organization? You can get all this data, but do your people know how to use it? And it was very interesting, the transition from 2019 to 2020, we saw a actual decrease in the amount of reported dollars spent to train people in supply chain, when at the same time we saw consistently that chief executive officers, chief procurement officers, etc., continued to say that data and the use of data by their organization is critical to their organization's success. So we couldn't dig down below that because the way the questions were asked, but it was an interesting situation. Now that it raises the question is, are people thinking that they're going to maybe outsource this kind of functionality as opposed to providing or building internal capabilities or not? That's strictly speculation. Our data doesn't allow us to validate that assumption or that statement, but it was interesting to see the increased importance placed on data, yet the decrease in dollars associated with training people how to interpret the data. Very, very interesting and kind of confusing situation there. We see that in the supply chain, you think about what we do in supply chain, and you have large corporations in supply chains that could have 10, 20, 30,000 suppliers, especially if you're a worldwide organization. Not all suppliers are key suppliers, critical suppliers, and not all of those numbers are active. Sometimes, in the supplier database, you get somebody who used one time for a product or service, and that's it. So you kind of contaminate the set of data with your assumption that they're ongoing, but let's just say the majority are. When you think of the number of communication channels that take place with those suppliers and the data that gets handed off, it's astronomical. If you think of, let's say we have a supplier and I'm a company, and let's say we have 10,000 active suppliers, right? Which is probably not uncommon in many large corporations, especially those who are global in nature. You have contacts every day through emails that most of the time that data or information or knowledge exchange is not captured in any way. It's there. I mean, it's captured in the sense that it's an email, but you don't have an ability in most cases to extract anything from that. So one of the challenges that as we progress here, more and more data and information are exchanged and stored and digitally, but how do we extract them? So we have the traditional, structured data, which is, spreadsheets, databases, databases have X and Y axis with values in the cells, right? And we can manipulate that. We can look for trends, etc. More than 80% of the data that's created in today's world is now unstructured data. So it's emails, it's videos, it's text messages. That is the challenge that we're facing right now, especially with the emphasis on risk management. So we're not going to be able to get a lot of risk assessment, real-time risk assessment out of structured data. We're not going to get real-time, even if we just look at financial data. Financial data in most cases is not real-time that we can get at suppliers. It could be quarterly statements or whatever. In some cases, if they're privately held, we can get very little financial data. When we're trying to do risk assessment and supply chain, we want real data. Real data is usually unstructured. We want to know that a fire just occurred at a supplier's plant, or they're having a major outbreak of COVID, or they're selling one of their factories that we may not know about, or they're acquiring and building. There may be political issues, regulatory issues, etc. So this whole idea of capturing data and the importance of unstructured data, and then of course the challenges of gleaning information out of unstructured data is critical. There are companies making significant use of tools, but again, we can find things, then it's validating the source so we understand it's credible and we believe it, and then we can act upon that information.
Mm-hmm. I think all these are valid points. With regards to blockchain, I think something particularly interesting in the space of supply chains. I think we see a few competing solutions, and obviously none of them have anything to do with cryptocurrencies. It's something which we didn't mention until now. I was just thinking, I'm not sure what was the background of our audience, and maybe some people are here because they're attracted to blockchain, and many people associate blockchain with cryptocurrencies and tokens. And what I find interesting is that supply chain, which is one of the most solid use cases of blockchain, has absolutely nothing to do with tokens.
Right.
What do you think, Joseph, about that?
Right. Yeah. Well, again, we all hear about blockchain and its application towards cryptocurrency. That's the main driver. But as we look at supply chain, we're trying to move towards the term that you'll see out there now is smart contracts, right? So what do we mean by a smart contract? Well, a smart contract is basically, in its simplest terms, it's basically a decision based on, if then conditional rules. So if something happens and it's addressed in the contract, some action might be taken. So contracts have components to them that say, here's the criteria that you will operate against based on this contract. You'll have, I'll try to keep it, again, very simple so we can just talk about the thought process here. So, we have a delivery requirement, or we have a price variance requirement, etc. Well, we can capture the data, and it'd be good if it went into blockchain because nobody can vary it. Then once it's there, it's there. Okay, assuming it's correct when it gets entered, and we secured. We know then the smart contract can go against that blockchain data and say, okay, this supplier is out of the terms and conditions of the contract, and therefore here's the predefined course of action. Let's say that after 3 late deliveries, again, keep it simple, they're notified, and then after a 5th incident of late delivery, the contract is terminated. Well, okay, think back again. We have these large corporations that are dealing with tens and thousands of suppliers. How can a person be aware, whoever the contract administrator is, how are he and she be aware of a violation of one of the terms and conditions of the contract? The reality is they're not, unless somebody's brought it to their attention. What we want to have is smart contracts that, again, have software connected with the contract, and it understands the language of the contract, and it can identify when those variations or violations of the contract terms occur, and we can empower the smart contract to take the action that's pre-described in the contract for its execution. So again, the example I gave, after three late deliveries, it would electronically send a notice to the supplier saying, be aware you're at risk of this contract, your violation of term contract. It gets shaky when we get to the example I gave was the fifth violation, and we terminate the contract. Well, up to now in the United States, there's no legal framework that a court would recognize for that machine decision to terminate a contract. So several states now, there's less than 12 in the United States, have put in place legislation that allows for the creation of a legal framework where smart contracts can exist. We go back to that data better be 100% correct, because if it caused you to terminate a contract and it's wrong, it opens you up to legal liabilities. So there's a lot depending on the data, the quality of the data, and how it's used, but we cannot manage in the complex world that we live in today, and we don't have enough resources. No organization has enough resources to manage these suppliers properly. We need to have some sense of augmentation by using systems to help us get there. So we're at the early stages of a lot of technologies. When you think of that, we just kind of discussed possibly, the use of IoT for sensors to administer against a contract. We talked about using computing on the edge to simplify the information that then would maybe go into blockchain. Blockchain then would be monitored by a smart contract, and the smart contract would then have the ability to execute certain terms and conditions against that agreement. So all these technologies are building upon each other. They're at different levels of deployment and confidence in usage.
I think something else that's important to mention is that with this document that we briefly discussed at the beginning, and I just shared this with everyone, the supply chain data audit guidelines. And while this event is about applications of data science and AI in the supply chain, I think that many, I guess even maybe most of the things covered in that document, they apply in most industries, not just supply chain, because many of the things that are discussed in the document are just very sound practices for data strategy and management. And you're not a professional industry, then you still benefit from reading this. And I guess this probably goes back to one of the points we discussed at the beginning, when I asked you, Joseph, whether there's something that makes supply chain special. And I think that on one hand, there are many applications and synergies of technologies like IoT, AI, blockchain within the space of supply chain. On the other hand, I think that the same principles that are, the fundamental principles that determine good data governance, data management strategy in supply chain are pretty much the same across most verticals. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. And, it's not just manufacturing, it's education, it's service sector. We talk about the service sector, we haven't really mentioned the technology because it's even on the earlier stages, but there's for voice recognition and stuff, there's a lot of research being done on sentiment. And what that means is, by monitoring the spoken word, and as humans, when we talk to somebody, we can kind of tell if they're frustrated or, just angry, or they're satisfied with the answer, etc. And there's tools now, software tools, that are making pretty good progress on sentiment analysis. So you can have software tools monitoring a dialogue, let's say to a call center, and you could see how the person responded and how well that response was received. They can help refine the approach on how to do customer service and things of that nature. So there's this verging of all these accelerated technologies. Some will play a bigger role in supply chain and some will play a lesser role, but I think they'll all, when it comes down to it, whether it's business to business or business to consumers, there's always individuals to individuals. It's not just, certain tasks can be machine to machine, but ultimately it's people to people. And one of the things we're struggling with is how much can we as individuals absorb and interpret and make decisions on. There's some very interesting research done that says the human brain can handle, they call it the 5+or-2 guidelines. And research by psychiatrists and everyone else has shown that the human brain can probably handle 5, maybe 7, or maybe down to 3 simultaneous inputs in making a decision. But beyond that, it's our brain just can't handle that volume, right? So our brains haven't changed, but our ability to get more information presented to us has increased dramatically. So how do we do that? How do we filter it out to the key decision elements that we need to make a decision? Because that's really what it's all about. It's very interesting. Most companies, our study and others, have shown that most organizations use on average between 4 to 6 data sources in making a decision. So it's very interesting. The question is are those data sources in sync with each other? Meaning it's something, annual versus daily versus real time. How do we discriminate and put different weights on those data sources when we make a decision? Some of them are subjective, oh, that was good, or that was acceptable. Well, what does that mean? And other ones are, here's a scale of 1 to 12, and you're at number 6. So this whole thing of using data, because data isn't always like we've been mentioning here, isn't always as simplistic as a numeric value in some sort of database, whether it be Excel or whatever. I don't want to get too parochial on the term database, but in some file of some sort that we can analyze.
I think that there's someone asking about a medical supply chain, and they're interested in a real-world case study. To be honest with you, I can't think of one on top of my head. I would actually have to research this. I know that, this is not like supply chain per se. I know that there are people working, and I was actually involved in a project of this kind, in vaccine passports that are based on blockchain. So it's not supply chain per se, but it's not, it's not like a use case that's completely, let's say, deassociated from what we're discussing. I'm not sure, Joseph, if you have any case studies in mind.
Regards to healthcare?
Yeah, like medical supply chain. Because one of our participants is asking us about this.
Well, it's very interesting. I'll just maybe make 2 comments on that. About a year ago, there was an article in New York Times, or excuse me, Wall Street Journal, I think, about Mass General Hospital, a huge hospital in Boston. They were doing an assessment kind of when COVID started about what supplies they have, and they found that there were about 100 pharmaceutical items that were used kind of typically across any hospital for normal surgery, not related to COVID. This is just general healthcare. And they found out that 100 of those components were in short supply, and they didn't even have enough. And so people start focusing in on what data they have to understand what their capabilities are or what might impede their capabilities to go forward. The other thing, I just had a discussion a few days ago with the 4 graduate students at the Naval Contract Academy in Monterey, California. And one of their projects is to try to assess the military's readiness on a global basis, U.S. military on a global basis, to respond to specifically COVID needs of supplies to support COVID. And what they're finding, and it's not anything that isn't well known, is that they're not in any better shape than the general public is in understanding their supplies for response. Their research was strictly for COVID. So the medical field is huge. There's over, I think the numbers I've seen, there's something like there's 8,000 hospitals within the United States. I think that's a fairly accurate number. And many of them work independently, and they don't share information. Another gentleman I know was a consultant and was doing some work in this medical field. He was shocked, and COVID has helped some of this, but 3 hospitals in a major metropolitan area in Texas, a major city there, we're not sharing any information amongst each other. And so they're actually competing against each other in a marketplace for supplies. And in essence, they could have helped each other out in many ways, not only collective buying, but also in sharing, where one hospital might have a slight surplus, the other one's in a dire need. And so all this is coming about, and how do we share information? And just to spin off that a little bit, in order to share information, we need to have standards. So there is a standard group out there. I'm not sure if people are familiar with the ISO standards, International Standards Organization, a global organization trying to create global standards for everything, not just supply chain or data. But there is an ISO standard which very few people know about. It's called ISO 8000, and ISO 8000 addresses data quality issues. So that's an attempt, and some corporations like Corning Glass and others that I know of are implementing ISO 8000. So when they exchange data amongst themselves, even within their own different divisions and with their suppliers, they're using the same data vernacular, terminology, data formats, so that they can openly exchange data. And it's not just at the organizational level. Countries are starting to try to do this too, because they understand that their organizations within their countries are suffering. So you might be aware, Stoliansi, the United Kingdom, they had a government data quality framework, which was published in 2020, just recently, December 2020. Australia has the Australian Bureau of Statistics, which published some data standards in 2016. Canada, Statistics of Canada, published in December of 2019. So countries, are starting to address this at a national level to try to put some framework so that their companies and organizations can be more competitive. So it's like unlimited work in this space. It's almost too much to absorb for one person, at least for me it is, because there's just so much going on. But the good news is there's progress being made. I know the UN has tried to do this with some of their food programs around the world. So it is amazing. Lots of data out there, but it may not be in a format that's usable in any aggregate way. And these standard organizations are trying to put some framework around it, so eventually they can evolve to a smooth exchange of data and interpretation of that data. Because again, we use the data as the building block, right? We use data. If we have data, then it moves to information, which means kind of like pulling the stuff together, summarizing it, analyzing it, and then we take that into something that's executionable at the knowledge level. So we got data goes to information, information goes to knowledge, right? That's where we're all trying to get to, because we're all trying to use data to help us make better informed, real-time decisions.
And I think that's I think this is a great comment, and probably a great sentence to finish the webinar with. I guess it's now 5 p.m. And probably many people have to go on other calls and other things. So thanks everyone for joining us. Once again, make sure to check out our websites, Tesseract Academy, Tesseract.academy, the data scientist, and also the website of our organization. We're going to be organizing more of those types of events. And if you have any questions, just feel free to send us an email. If you want to get access, just to the decision makers handbook to data science or the supply chain audit guidelines, feel free to shoot us an email. And before we go, Joseph, any last comments?
No, I appreciate everyone taking the time to listen in. I hope we touched on some subjects that maybe either created a thought for you or maybe gave you some sense of direction. Thank you. We appreciate all comments. We hope on future webinars that you and some of your friends and allies and co-workers will be able to join us, and hopefully we're going to have more time for more of a dialogue, which would be great. It's an exciting area. We're all learning, and it's moving very quickly. So to the extent we can share, it would be great. So thank you once again for participating in today's call.
Yeah, thanks everyone. And the recording will be available hopefully tomorrow on the Tesseract Academy website and on YouTube. So make sure to subscribe. Thanks, and hopefully see you all soon.
Bye now.